G'day, this is Chris Savage from RL Ministries in Australia, welcoming you to this session of the book of Ezekiel. This is a study that has been prepared by Dr. Al Fruchtenbaum of RL Ministries worldwide. Thank you for coming along. So we're up to session 39, which is the second last session of the book of Ezekiel. We're going to finish off chapter 47, verses 1 to 20 tonight. And here we go. We're looking at the millennial river, verses 1 to 12 of chapter 47. Now, Ezekiel begins to discuss this river, and this passage is subdivided into three smaller units. We've got a bit of a diagram as well. Well, two diagrams are put in there to help you to see how this river runs. And first of all, we're going to have the source of the river in verses 1 to 2. And he brought me back. Now the angels brought Ezekiel back onto the door of the house, and behold, waters issued out from under the threshold of the house eastward. For the forefront of the house was toward the east. And the waters came down from the right side of the house, on the south of the altar. Then he brought me out by the way of the gate northward, and led me round by the way without onto the outer gate, by the way of the gate that looketh toward the east. And behold, there ran out waters on the right side. Now, verse 1 deals with the actual origin of the millennial river. He says, he brought me back onto the door of the house. So from where he had been standing in the outer court, according to chapter 46:21, Ezekiel is now brought back into the inner court where he had been previously. And behold, waters issued out from under the threshold of the house eastward. For the forefront of the house was toward the east, and the waters came down from under the right side of the house on the south side of the altar. Now, dealing with the details here, we learn that from the right side of the house, from part of the east wall of the holy place, between the door and the pillars, a stream was flowing out in a southeasterly direction, and it went past the altar on the south side of the altar, and emerging into the open on the south side of the outer eastern gate. So the stages of the stream's flow are as follows. First of all, it trickles out, which is what the Hebrew word yatsa, translated issued out, means. And it issued out from the south corner of the temple threshold. And then it runs by the altar of the sacrifice on the south side of the altar of sacrifice. And then it runs out of the temple compound on the south side of the closed outer eastern gate. Remember, the outer eastern gate is locked permanently. Now, this is a schematic here of it, and you can see that dark blue line there, which is my squiggly line from today. That is where the water comes out from the temple compound, past just south of the altar, and then comes out through the outer eastern gate, trickles out from underneath it. Now, verse 2 describes its exit. Then he brought me out by the way of the gate northward. So Ezekiel now makes a detour through the inner and outer northern gates, to see, because that's the only way he can get out, to see where this river exits out of the temple compound. He has to use the northern gate, remember, because of course the inner and outer eastern gates were both closed. He led me round by the way without onto the outer gate, by the way of the gate that looketh toward the east. So from the northern outer gate, he was now conducted outside the outer wall of the temple compound and brought right around to the outer eastern gate. And behold, he says, there ran out waters on the right side. Hebrew word for ran out is ahapak. And this is a uniquely used Hebrew word in the text here. It means to trickle out. Now, what trickles out in verses 1 to 2 will become a river, as we're going to see in verses 3 to 5. He says it comes out on the right side of the outer eastern gate, which would make it the south side. And the waters trickled out of the temple compound into the open space on the south side of the outer eastern gate. Now, having now dealt with the source of this stream, he now goes on to deal with its depth, how deep it is. Verses 3 to 5. When the man went forth eastward with the line in his hand, he measured 1,000 cubits, and he caused me to pass through the waters that were to the ankles. Again, he measured 1,000 and caused me to pass through the waters, waters that were to the knees. Again, he measured 1,000 and caused me to pass through the waters, waters that were to the loins. And in verse 5, it says, afterward he measured 1,000, and it was a river that I could not pass through. For the waters were risen, waters to swim in, a water that could not be passed through. So in these verses, he deals with a miraculous increase in the depth of this river, and he describes it in 4 stages. First stage in verse 3, man went forth eastward with the line, measuring line, and he measured 1,000 cubits. 1,000 cubits is around about 530 meters, 1,750 feet, about a third of a mile. So he caused me to pass through the waters, and the waters were up to my ankles. So after this distance of like 530 meters or so, 1,000 cubits, from the outer eastern gate, the stream had risen to the depth of a man's ankles. Remember, it trickled out from under the temple compound. It trickled out past the outer eastern gate, and now it's ankle deep. This is after 500 meters or 1,000 cubits from its exit. Second stage, in the first part of verse 4, again he measured 1,000 and caused me to pass through the waters. So these are waters that were to the knees. So after a further 1,700 feet, which would now make it 3,500 feet or around about 1 kilometer, 2/3 of a mile, from the outer eastern gate, he's 2/3 of a mile away or a kilometer away, the waters are now knee deep. And the third stage is in the second part of verse 4, where again he measured 1,000 and caused me to pass through waters that were to the loins. So after a distance now of 1,500 or 1,600 meters or 5,250 feet, almost a mile away from the outer eastern gate, the waters have now become waist deep. So we're looking a kilometer and a half away from when it started. It's now waist deep. Then came the fourth stage in verse 5. Afterwards he measured 1,000, and it was a river that I would not pass through, for the waters were risen, waters to swim in, a river that could not be passed through. So now he's at a distance of around about almost 2 kilometers, which is nearly a mile and 1.3 miles, and this river had become impassable. You could only swim it. So overall, there was a massive and miraculous rise in the depth of the water. Now we come to its productive powers. And again, just a reminder, this is you can see there, it comes out of the temple, it goes to the east through the outer eastern gate, and then it drops down, comes down, and it's going to head down into Jerusalem, the city itself. Now, in verses 6 to 12, we're going to see its productive abilities. And he said unto me, Son of man, hast thou seen this? And he brought me and caused me to return to the bank of the river. Now when I had returned, behold, upon the bank of the river were very many trees on the one side and on the other. We'll just do verses 6 and 7 here. In this passage now, Ezekiel deals with the productive abilities of the river. So in these 2 verses, first of all, he deals with his own return to the bank. It's the bank of the river. In verse 6, a question is asked. He said unto me, Son of man, hast thou seen this? That is, have you noticed a miraculous increase in the depth of the water? And of course, Ezekiel he certainly has seen it. And by the way, this is the last time the term Son of Man will be used in his book, making a total of 92 times he has been addressed in this way. Then he brought me and caused me to return to the bank of the river, so that he might obtain a better view of the extraordinary fertility that the waters had produced. As he returns, he sees something else miraculous. And in verse 7, he tells us about the trees on the riverbank that clearly were not there before, because there wasn't any river there before. But now there's a river, and now there's trees in the bank. When I had returned, behold, on the bank of the river were very many trees on the one side and the other. Now, obviously, these trees were not there when Ezekiel began his 4,000 cubit trek along the bank, but they were there now. And so this 2-kilometer trek along the bank. And now this river, the river is shown to have miraculous, life-giving productivity abilities. And that is what he now sees. Then he said to me, verse 8, we're going to read the rest of it now, verse 8 to verse 11. Then he said unto me, these waters issue forth toward the eastern region, and shall go down into the Arabah, and they shall go toward the sea. Into the sea shall the waters go which were made to issue forth, and the waters shall be healed. It shall come to pass that every living creature which swarmeth in every place whither the rivers come shall live, and there shall be a very great multitude of fish. For these waters are come thither, and the waters of the sea shall be healed, and everything shall live whithersoever the river cometh. And it shall come to pass that fishers shall stand by it from En Gedi even unto En Eglaim, shall be a place for the spreading of nets. Their fish shall be after their kinds, as the fish of the great sea, exceeding many. But the miry places thereof and the marshes thereof shall not be healed. They shall be given up to salt. Okay. In verses 8 to 11, he now deals with the course of the river and its effects. In verse 8, it starts to flow out in an easterly direction. Then said he unto me, these waters issue forth toward the eastern region. So it commences its flow eastward out of the temple compound, extending over a great area eastwards through the northern Zadokite section of the Holy Oblation, before it now makes a turn towards the south. And he says it shall go down to the Arabah, which is the river's ultimate goal, actually. And so, that is, the Arabah is the Dead Sea, and into the sea shall the waters go. So there's another sea mentioned, which is the Mediterranean Sea, which were made, the term which were made to issue forth, the Hebrew word hamotzaim for issue forth, it actually has the sound of a dual form, but technically it's not. Now, the rabbis, based upon the sound of the word, interpreted the phrase as meaning that the river will divide into two rivers, right? Because it sounded like it, the word, like it divided into two rivers. Now, one of the rivers will flow into the Dead Sea, the other into the Mediterranean Sea. Now, while it cannot be deduced from that one Hebrew word, hamotzaim, to issue forth, it's a valid statement because of what we read in other passages of Scripture. Two other Old Testament passages deal with the millennial river. And in order to understand its course, we must take them both into consideration. Zechariah, the first one is Zechariah 14, verse 8, where we learn that this river that flows out of the temple compound will first of all flow as a single river as far south as millennial Jerusalem. Initially, it will flow east through much of the Zadokite territory, then turn south to the Levite territory as far as the city of Jerusalem. Once it gets there, it will divide into two rivers. One will flow east into the Dead Sea, and the other will flow west into the Mediterranean Sea. The other passage is Joel chapter 3, verse 18, which gives us a summary of its entire course. He says, a fountain shall come forth from the house of Jehovah. So just like Ezekiel, Joel says that this river has its origin in the temple compound. Then Joel says, it shall water the valley of Shittim, which is by the Arabah section, which is by the Dead Sea. So Joel is basically summarizing what Ezekiel is expounding upon here. And the result, Ezekiel notes, is the waters shall be healed. That is, the briny, salty waters of the Dead Sea will be healed. Now, the Dead Sea is unable to sustain life because of the density of its salt content. But in the future, it will be able to carry life, have much life in it. And that is the course of the river in conjunction with Joel 3:18 and Zechariah 14, verse 8. Begins in the temple compound, flowing eastwards through the Zadokite territory, then it turns south through Levite territory until it reaches Jerusalem, where it divides into two streams. Half flowing east into the through the fruit-growing area down the slopes of the mountain of Jehovah's house into the Dead Sea. The other branch flows westward through the fruit-growing area on that side of the mountain and empties into the Mediterranean Sea. This means that the millennial river will also flow through the prince's territory as well. Remember, prince had territory on both sides of the mountain. Now, verses 9 to 11 talk about its effects. First of all, in verse 9, the effects upon the Dead Sea are as follows. And it shall come to pass that every living creature which swarmeth in every place where the river comes shall live. Notice that the word rivers here is plural. In Hebrew, it's nahalem, and this word is a clear dual meaning, rivers. It's two rivers. Literally, it means in every place where the two rivers shall come. So in keeping with what Zechariah 14:8 tells us, here it clearly infers now that the one river becomes two rivers. So the original river will divide. According to Zechariah 14:8, this will happen when it hits Jerusalem. And there shall be a very great multitude of fish, for these waters are come thither, and the waters of the sea shall be healed, and everything shall live whithersoever the river cometh. So wherever this river goes, it results in a great swarming of fish life. It is in this sense that the Dead Sea will be healed. It will become full of life. And then in verse 10, he deals with its effect upon the fishing industry. It shall come to pass that fishers shall stand by it from En Gedi even unto En Eglaim, shall be a place for the spreading of nets. Now, En Gedi is on the western shore of the Dead Sea, somewhere about midway along it, but En Eglaim is toward the northwestern shore of the Dead Sea. It's now known as Ein Feshka. Ein Feshka. Today, if anyone travels down through this particular territory, they'll not find anyone fishing there. There's no fish there, too salty. The Dead Sea is chemically such that it is incapable of bearing life. However, this will all change once the millennial river begins to empty into it, because it will cause life to swarm wherever it flows. Now, according to Ezekiel's prophecy, the section of shore between En Gedi and Ein Eglaim is going to be the center of a new fishing industry. The expression, the spreading of nets, is a symbol of fishing, or a symbol for fishing. So what is impossible around the Dead Sea at the present time will be reversed, and it's going to become a major industry in the future. Their fish shall be after their kinds as the fish of the great sea. In other words, the Dead Sea at that time will contain as many different species as are found in the Mediterranean Sea, exceeding many, as Ezekiel says. So there's going to be an abundance of fish in the Dead Sea when this time comes. And then in verse 11 is a third result, where he deals with the land of salt. Now this is referring to the southern end of the Dead Sea, which clearly is not going to be healed. But the miry places thereof and the marshes thereof, these will be at the very southern end, will not be affected by the waters of the river. Its effects will not extend that far south. He says they shall be given up to salt. Now, Hebrew expression here, Nathan Malak, or given up to salt, can be translated in two different ways. It can indeed mean given up to salt as a sign of judgment or as a commodity. But remember, still going to be using salt in the kingdom. Now, if that is the meaning here in Ezekiel, then it's a sign of judgment, as we see from Deuteronomy 29:23, Judges 9:45, Psalm 107 verse 34, and Jeremiah 17 verse 6. Now that's one possible meaning. It means giving up to judgment. Now, the southern part of the Dead Sea is going to be in very close proximity to the land of Edom. So that's possibly why it's going to be given up to judgment. Now, as we have seen before from our study the book of Ezekiel, the land of Edom will become a land of perpetual judgment. It's a land of continuous burning. It's a wasteland of brimstone. Remember, it's going to be uninhabitable during the kingdom. So, because the southern part of the Dead Sea is near the land of Edom, it may well share. Remember, they were saying that there's two possible scenarios there. In the judgment scenario, it may well share in the judgment of Edom and therefore be given up to salt. Second possible translation of that phrase is, it shall be given up for salt. And in this case, the phrase would mean that this southern part of the Dead Sea will not be healed in order to provide salt for the inhabitants of the land in the kingdom. The marshy land in the southern end of the Dead Sea will remain in its former state to supply the need for salt among the population. So either one of these things is possible, and perhaps even both are intended. And the southern end of the Dead Sea will remain under judgment because of its close proximity to the land of Edom being given up to it, being given up to salt. But then, having thus been given up to salt, it will continue to provide salt as a commodity for the people of Israel and perhaps for the whole world. And the last thing emphasized in verse 12 is the fertility which accompanies the presence of the river. And by the river, upon the bank thereof, on this side and on that side, meaning on both banks, shall grow every tree for food. Now, this is the river that's coming down from the temple into Jerusalem. So there'll be an abundance of fruit trees on both banks of the millennial river along its whole course. And even after it now splits into two, Ezekiel is seeing the banks of the river. It says, whose leaves shall not wither. It shall always be green, the leaves of the trees. Neither shall the fruit thereof fail. They'll always be productive. It shall bring forth new fruit every month. This means there'll be a new crop of fruit every month. And the reason for this intense fertility is because the waters thereof issue out of the sanctuary. So the source of the river is the holy temple itself, and because of that, it will be a life-giving river. It's supporting an abundance of evergreen fruit trees on both its banks, producing a new crop every single month. Now it concludes with the twofold usage of these trees. It will involve the fruit and the leaves. The fruit thereof shall be for food. Therefore, this fruit is intended to be eaten. The leaf thereof shall be for healing. So the leaves are going to have therapeutic qualities. Okay, there's that. A diagram there just to put it all together, if you like. So it goes down into the city, splits into left and right, east and west, and goes through those growing areas, east and west, and then goes into the Dead Sea on the west, on the east, and into the Mediterranean Sea on the east. On the Dead Sea on the east and the Mediterranean Sea on the west. Now, we're going to look at millennial Israel, which is going to take us from 47:13 down to 48:29. Let's see what we can get through. Now, in verses 13 to 14 of 47, this is now going to be the fulfillment of the covenant. Thus says the Lord Jehovah, this shall be the border whereby you shall divide the land for inheritance according to the 12 tribes of Israel. Joseph shall have 2 portions, and you shall inherit it, one as well as another. For I swear to give it unto your fathers, and this land shall fall unto you for inheritance. Now, point of these 2 verses here is to show that in the millennium, only now will the covenant find its complete fulfillment insofar as it relates to the boundaries in settling the borders of the land. In verse 13, he deals with the division according to the tribes. Thus says the Lord Jehovah, this shall be the border whereby you shall divide the land for inheritance according to the 12 tribes of Israel. So the land is to be divided once again according to its tribal divisions. We're going to see as we go through that the tribes will not be allotted land in the same geographical relationships as under Joshua. However, there'll certainly be tribal divisions in the Messianic Israel. But then he says, Joseph shall have two portions. Now, because Joseph was considered to be the father of the 12 tribes, so one portion would include the tribe of Ephraim, and the other would be for the tribe of Manasseh, both his sons. Now, the background to all of this is to be found, of course, in the book of Genesis. Remember, Reuben was the firstborn son of Jacob, and usually the firstborn son would have had the double portions or the double blessings. He would have had the two portions. But Reuben lost his birthright because of a sin that he committed, which is dealt with in Genesis 35, verse 22, and Genesis 49, verses 3 to 4. So as a result of his sin, Reuben lost the right to receive two portions. So then in Genesis 48, verses 5 to 6 and 22, Jacob promises that the birthright will go to Joseph. In Genesis 49, 22 to 26, where Jacob blesses his 12 sons prophetically, he emphasizes again that Joseph would have the birthright of two portions. And then in 1 Chronicles 5:1, it's clearly stated that Joseph received Reuben's birthright. So in verse 13 of chapter 47, the millennial division of the land of Israel will be according to tribes, and Joseph will receive two portions. And then in verse 14, we read about the covenantal basis behind it. You shall inherit it, one as well as another. So what this is saying is that each tribe will receive its portion equally, and all 12 portions will be exactly the same, exactly alike. Now, this is another contrast with the Mosaic system, because in the Mosaic system, remember, every tribe received their portion in accordance with their relative size. And we see that in Numbers 26, verse 52 to 56. But in the kingdom, in the millennial kingdom, messianic kingdom, every tribe will have an equal portion. For I swear to give it to your fathers. Literally, the Hebrew reads, for I have lifted up my hand, and God lifting up his hand emphasizes the solemnity of God's oath. And this fulfillment of the covenant in the millennial kingdom is based upon God's oath to their fathers. Now, who are their fathers? Well, specifically, the inheritance of the entire promised land will be a fulfillment of two covenants, the Abrahamic covenant and the Palestinian or land covenant. The result will be, this land shall be unto you for inheritance. Now we're going to go into the borders of the land in verses 15 to 20. And verses 15 to 20, he deals with the borders, and this serves to clearly spell out where the borders are. We're going to break it down into their border areas here. So we're going to look at verses 15 to 17. And this shall be the border of the land on the north side, from the great sea by way of Hethlon into the entrance of Zedad, Hamath, Berothah, Sibram, which is between the border of Damascus and the border of Hamath, Hazer Hattikon, which is by the border of Haran, and the border from the sea shall be Hazar Ainon, the border of Damascus, and the northward, and on the northward is the border of Hamath. This is the north side. Okay. Now, so he now spells out the borders of millennial Israel. And from these borders, it is clear that this will include for the first time all of the promised land. Verses 15 to 17, he deals with the northern border. This shall be the border of the land on north side from the Great Sea. That is, Great Sea is the Mediterranean Sea. So we're going to start on the north side from the western shore, which is the Mediterranean Sea, which is on the west side, and the border is now going to run towards the east to form the northern border. And it says it comes out by the way of Hethlon. Now, Hethlon could be one of two places. One is called Adlon, and the other Haitela, which is 6 miles northeast of Tripoli or 10 miles north of Tyre. Now, basically, the northern border will enter through what is now Lebanon, between the ancient towns of Zarephath and Tyre, onto the entrance of Zedad. We don't actually know where Zedad is, but it could be what is now known as Sadad, which is 25 miles north of Damascus, which is southeast of Homs. These are just guesses. Next landmark is Hamath. Hamath is Hama on the Orontes River, which is 115 miles north of Damascus, which is also mentioned in Zechariah 9:2 and Amos 6:2. And then he mentions Berothah, which is the same as Berothai in 2 Samuel 8:8, which is in Syria today. The modern town is known as Bratan, which is south of Baalbek. The next border marker he mentions is Sibraim, which is between the border of Damascus and the border of Hamath. Now, Sibraim is the same as Ziphron of Numbers 34, verse 9, and it sits between Hamath and Homs. There's a lot of names here, but this is the northern border we're looking at. Next marker is Hazar Hatikon, which literally means central Hazar, which is by the border of Haran. It covers the region east of the Sea of Galilee, the right-hand side of the Sea of Galilee, also known as Bashan. It's better known as the area of the Golan Heights, and that is where Haran is. But the exact location of Hazar Hatikon is unknown, because it might be the same as Hazar Ainon, which some people say is Banias. Now, Banias is also known as Caesarea Philippi. At any rate, it's the border from the sea, and this now refers to the Sea of Galilee. Now, basically, the northern border seems to run from the Mediterranean Sea about 100 miles north of Tyre and running across until it comes to the Euphrates River, and it follows the Euphrates River for a short distance before it begins cutting south again. So it goes across, follows the river, and drops down. We're going to talk more about it shortly. So the border from the Sea of Galilee shall be Hazar Ainon, the border of Damascus, and on the northward is the border of Hamath. This is the north side. So northern border, as described by Ezekiel here, is an extension of the border given by Moses in Numbers 34:7-8. Numbers 34:7-8. The northern border of the kingdom is going to be extended. So it begins at its western end, about 100 miles north of Tyre. I think I might have said 10 miles before. It's 100 miles north of Tyre on the Mediterranean Sea. It cuts across most of what is now Lebanon and into Syria, then into Iraq, until it comes to the river Euphrates. It then runs parallel with the river for only a short distance, for about 115 miles north of the Syrian city of Damascus. And then it now drops down. And the east side, so that's the north side, the east side between Haran and Damascus and Gilead and the land of Israel shall be the Jordan. And the north border unto the east shall you measure. This is now the east side. In verse 18, he gives the eastern border, east side between Haran and Damascus. Now that's the starting point of the northern end of the eastern border. And Gilead and the land of Israel shall be the Jordan. So in other words, the Jordan River between the Sea of Galilee and the Dead Sea will now mark the eastern border. So from the north border onto the east sea shall you measure. North border begins at the Euphrates River. Now coming down south between Haran or the Golan Heights and Damascus. It then cuts into the southern part of the Sea of Galilee where the Jordan exits, and from then on, the Jordan becomes the eastern border all the way down to and through the Dead Sea. So that's the east side. That's the east border. Yeah, since this border will run down from the Euphrates between the Golan Heights and Damascus, it means that the Golan will be part of the millennial Israel, but Damascus will not be. And passing between these 2 points, the border will then make a bit of a curve toward the west until it reaches the southern shore of the Sea of Galilee. So it comes down between the Golan and Damascus, comes down between them, and cuts across to the west, the bottom of the Sea of Galilee, the southern shore of the Sea of Galilee. Now, so the whole of this, the Kinneret or the Sea of Galilee, is going to be part of the millennial land of Israel. Now, from that point south, from the Sea of Galilee south, the Jordan River now becomes the border. And this tells us now that the east bank will not be part of Israel. The east bank of the Jordan River will not be part of Israel. Now, if you cast your mind back, you'll realize that it formed part of the land under Joshua. But this is not going to be the case in the millennium, because also remember that that area was not originally part of the promised land anyway. It's just that there's a few of the tribes wanted to stay on that side of the land. So in dealing with the east side of the Jordan, it reverts back to the original border as Moses intended, and he records that in Numbers 34, 10 to 12. Okay. And then we have the south side southward, this is verse 19, the south side southward shall be from Tamar as far as the waters of Meriboth Kadesh to the brook of Egypt onto the great sea. So this is now the south side southward. In verse 19, he deals with the southern border. The south side southwards shall be from Tamar. Now, Tamar is the same as Hazazon Tamar of Genesis 14:7. Another name for Tamar is also Ein Gedi, according to 2 Chronicles 20, verse 2. Ein Gedi is on the western shore of the Dead Sea, just about midway on the western shore of the Dead Sea. And from this point, near the southwest side of the Dead Sea, the border will continue as far as the waters of Meriboth Kadesh. This is the same place as Kadesh Barnea of Numbers 27, verse 14. So this means the border is now going to cut through the Negev and into the wilderness of Zin. Not Sin, Zin. To the brook of Egypt. The brook of Egypt is the modern Wadi El Arish. And then it goes to the Great Sea, onto the Great Sea. So this Wadi empties into the Mediterranean Sea. This is the southern border, and it begins by cutting south and west from En Gedi on the southwest shore of the Dead Sea. So this means that the southern part of the Dead Sea is not included within the borders of millennial Israel. Now, if you remember from what we just spoke about in the millennial river, the southern end of the Dead Sea is going to be given over to salt. It'll be unusable except for the mining of salt. And in order to avoid the marshy area in that region, the border is going to run from Ein Gedi, which is going to be a center of the main fishing industry, and then cut southwest, moving through the Negev and the wilderness of Zin until it comes to Kadesh Barnea. Remember Kadesh Barnea? And this town, Kadesh Barnea, will mark the southern boundary of the land. And close by Kadesh Barnea, it will pick up the brook of Egypt. The brook of Egypt is not the Nile. It's the brook of Egypt, which is the Wadi El Arish. Some people think the border was the Nile River. And they're going to follow it until it empties into the Mediterranean Sea. And this is in keeping with the Mosaic southern border in Numbers 34, verses 1 to 5. And then we see on the west side, well, that's an easy side to picture what the border is there. On the west side shall be the Great Sea. From the south border, as far as over against the entrance of Hamath, this is not Hamas, Hamath, this is the west side. So in verse 20, he deals with the western border. And the west side shall be the Great Sea. Mediterranean Sea is going to be the western border. From the south border, where we had the Wadi El Arish, or the brook of Egypt, as far as over against the entrance of Hamath, which is where the northern border comes in through Lebanon. This is the west side. So the Mediterranean always was the western border, in keeping with Numbers 34, verse 6. So these are the north, east, south, and western borders of the land. And here's this is a picture from out of the Dr. Fruchtenbaum's maps of Israel, and that gives us a rough idea of where it is. There's the red line there, which is the border which we just looked at. But there's another, you see a possible alternate border there in that purple line. But the red line is the one which runs right across and then cuts down through the Golan Heights and Damascus, and then cuts in towards the Sea of Galilee. Okay, now that is your lot for this session. So study hard, grow strong, and next session will be the last session of the book of Ezekiel. Thank you for coming along.